Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be taking a look at the other side of industrialization and kind of the effects on the working class. So we've been focusing in class on the industrialists, their methods of domination of an industry. Today we're going to take a look at what does this mean for workers? What is the average American? How is their life being affected living in the industrial age and working in factories? So we're going to start with a term or a phrase that becomes synonymous with industrialization. So it's coined by Mark Twain. He refers to this whole time period from 1877 to 1900. He refers to it as the Gilded Age. Now, to understand what this means, you have to understand what gilding something is. So you're looking at a picture of somebody gilding a walnut. Why in the world anybody would gild a walnut, I have no idea. But essentially what gilding is you kind of brush this veneer of gold onto any kind of object. They usually do it with less valuable metals. So you might take a less valuable metal and you brush this gold veneer onto it. Now, if you think about what that is, essentially, if you were to chip away at the surface and get rid of that gold veneer, underneath you'd have really kind of a not so valuable piece of metal. Now, when Mark Twain calls this whole time period the Gilded Age, he's giving you an insight into his analysis of it and his perspective on the Gilded Age. And he's basically telling you that he believes all of this wealth in America, this great expansion of the economy, is really only skin deep. If you just brush away the surface, there's tons of problems in the United States. There's tons of economic situations that are not good for the working class. And really, he's trying to say only certain people are benefiting from industrialization. And so this whole term, the Gilded Age, is going to it's going to be a term that sticks, and it's also going to be a term that is used to define this industrial age. Because, like I said, not everybody is benefiting from it. And when you look at this quote from Mark Twain, it gives you some insight. And he's a product of this time period where people are getting exorbitantly rich and they're seeing dishonesty in their business practices. So he says, what is the chief end of man? And he says, to get rich. And in what way? Dishonestly if we can, and honestly if we must. And like I said, Mark Twain is a product of the time period. He sees people all around him, these industrialists getting extremely wealthy. And to them, the end game is making a profit. And if they can do it dishonestly, they will. If they have to do it honestly, if they're forced to do it honestly, then they also will. And so this is kind of the ideology that permeates the time period. And like we said, people are getting super, super wealthy. The inequality is growing in America. You have billionaires in an age where the average worker, or the person who works in these people's factories, somebody who works in Carnegie's factory or works for Rockefeller, they're making $500, $600, $700 a year. And the people who own these factories are becoming billionaires. And so the disparity in wealth is tremendous within the United States. And that brings with it all kinds of problems. And we talked today, partially the reason that this disparity is able to grow in the United States is because the government, to a large extent, is allowing this to happen and almost facilitating it to happen because they view business as their partner to a certain extent. And leaving business alone to its own practices is growing the U.S. economy, and which is beneficial for the United States as a country. And as this continues into the early 1900s, more and more Americans are going to get wealthier and wealthier. But if you notice here, it's much more diverse in the areas where their wealth is concentrated. Now, this is a famous political cartoon that we will analyze really in some depth on Monday. But it shows you the other element here of the Gilded Age. One of the reasons why they refer to this time period as the Gilded Age, it's not just that the wealth is kind of skin deep and concentrated in certain areas, it's also the view that these industrialists, to a certain extent, almost own the government. They're the larger-than-life figures in the back of the Senate here. They're the ones who are really, people are starting to feel like are calling the shot. And that's why they refer to them in this cartoon as the bosses of the Senate. And these people are using their money, this excessive wealth, to influence government and to influence legislation to benefit them. So one interesting development of the Gilded Age, although we talked in class, today about how the government subscribes to this ideology of laissez-faire economics, hands-off government, it's true in certain cases and not true in other cases. And this is where you really see the influence of your monopolists, your trusts, these big business owners, these industrialists. It's true they do practice laissez-faire when it benefits business because they think that benefiting business is beneficial to America. But you're also going to see these industrialists influence Congress to pass legislation and pass ideas that are going to help out big business. And the most obvious one is going to be with the railroad industry. So the railroad industry produces the most billionaires in the late 1800s. And they're going to use the government to stay out of their way when they want them to stay out of their way, but also to pass legislation to benefit them. And the best example of this are the government's going to pass these railroad land grants. And essentially what this did was it facilitates railroads to be built across large tracts of the United States, especially in the West, facilitating the transcontinental railroads. Because if you think about it, the railroad companies are going to get this land for free. Because if they had to pay to purchase all this land to lay their railroad tracks, the price of it would be exorbitant, and they wouldn't be willing to put that much of their own money into it. It wouldn't be financially viable to do that. And so the government is going to provide these land grants. Now, if you think about that, that's not laissez-faire economics at all. So when you look at it, these industrialists are swaying the government to stay out when it benefits them and to get involved when it also benefits them. And this leads to corruption. And the American people are feeling like the working class is the one who's being left out in the cold here, while industrialists are basically using the government to get what they want. So this political cartoon called The Bosses of the Senate really emphasizes this and becomes one of the most famous cartoons of the era. Now, in our own era, pretty recently in 2010, a Supreme Court case called Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. This is a pretty important Supreme Court case because what it did was it allowed people in the United States, through something called super PACs, to donate unlimited amounts of money to basically campaign for candidates. So there's a limit on how much an individual can donate to a certain candidate, for let's say a presidential candidate or a congressional candidate, to help them run their campaign. Well, what this did was it legalized this thing called super PACs, which means if, let's say, for example, you and a group of people were in favor of Hillary Clinton, and you wanted to try and get her elected, you guys could form a super PAC in favor of Hillary Clinton, and you kind of work independently of her, and you campaign to try and get her elected. And so a lot of the commercials you see on TV are run by super PACs. Now what this does is it puts a tremendous amount of money into politics. These people, like the Koch brothers, spend billions of dollars trying to get the presidential candidate that they want elected. Now, interestingly enough, a lot candidates on both the Democrat side and the Republican side spoke out against this during the 2016 campaign. You had Donald Trump, who constantly talked about how Hillary Clinton was taking huge donations during her campaign, and how he was financing a lot of his campaign on his own, so he wasn't beholden to these interests of big business. Bernie Sanders, this was a huge part of his campaign, talking about how he got small donations from people all across the United States. And so this was an issue in the late 1800s with kind of monopolists really kind of controlling parts of the government and using their money and their wealth and their influence to gain excessive influence and excessive access to Americans and American politicians at the time. Similar time period in certain ways today, as far as with this famous or this important case, Citizens United case. All right, now the people who are working in the factories themselves, they're not working under the best of conditions. So what we're first going to talk about is kind of the methods that they use in the factories to try and facilitate a more efficient workforce. And then we'll talk about kind of some of the deplorable conditions that people are working under and kind of accept. So the first thing you want to kind of understand is this whole idea known as Taylorization, also known as scientific management. So Taylorization is kind of a really important idea. What they're going to do is they're going to basically apply science and kind of the scientific method to work and kind of factory work. So this is kind of revolutionary. What they're going to do is they're going to kind of figure out what is the best way to perform a certain task in the factory. What's the most efficient way to do it? And once they find the most efficient way to do it, they're going to train all their other workers to do it that one way. And that will increase efficiency. So let's take a very easy example. Let's say a teacher asked you to staple a test for them. And you kind of think about, okay, what's going to be my method? Am I going to put the first page here, the second page here, the third page here, and my stapler here? And then I pick up each page and I staple it. Or am I going to have all 3 pages on the table and I'm going to hold the stapler in my hand and then I'm going to pick up the 3 pages and staple it? Now you may say, who cares? You know, either way you're going to kind of get this test stapled and it's going to be completed. But if you're a businessman, you do care. You want the absolute most efficient way to get it done. Okay, so you break the whole process down, figure out the best method, and you do it. Now, this is kind of similar to people in fast food restaurants and people all across America. They practice this Taylorization. When they get new workers, they train them in a very specific way on how to carry out their task. And what this does is it increases the efficiency of the worker. So if you remember in the early Industrial Revolution, it's the first time they're building factories. And just having a factory and having machines and bringing people to a central location is increasing efficiency. In this time period, they take it to the next level. Now they're managing these workers and training them a very specific way. And by doing that, they're able to increase efficiency even more. And they decompartmentalize the work. They give you one very specific task and another worker another specific task, and they break that work down. And by doing this, from a business perspective, you're saving money. Now, if you think about it from a worker's perspective, this makes work extremely tedious, extremely repetitive. You don't really have ownership over what you're making. You kind of become like a cog in a machine. Think of the factory and the workers as one giant machine, because that's how the factory owners think of it. And each person is kind of playing their role and pushing that product along. But there's no individuality in there. Everybody's kind of doing exactly the same thing. And it's efficient, but it's also takes a toll on a worker. Now, scientific management, as far as workers are concerned, is the least of their problems. They're dealing with all kinds of poor working conditions. So what you're going to see happen here is a lot of different kind of poor working conditions. So the first one that you're seeing here, we're going to look at some pictures by a famous photographer of the time period. His name is Lewis Hine. And Lewis Hine, he takes pictures of all different working conditions that he kind of sees. A lot of it's in New York City. Another famous person who's going to take pictures of all different kinds of places is Jacob Riis. So these people are expose photographers. And we'll get into this a little bit more in the progressive era. But what you're looking at here is what we would call a sweatshop. And now a sweatshop is a very specific kind of factory. These are illegal factories that are going to happen in places throughout America. They really don't follow any kind of conventions and rules. There's really no rules regulating these things. And so you have sweatshops kind of pop up. They're now illegal, but look at these conditions, these cramped conditions that people are working under. Another example of a sweatshop, people kind of working in very cramped, tight conditions. Limited lighting sources, limited cleanliness, limited sanitary conditions. People are going to be working in excessive hours, 14, 15 hours a day. was common, is normal to work 14, 15 hours a day. And this is life for them. This is life for the industrial worker, because at this time the workers have very little power. We're going to start to learn they're going to try and form labor unions, but labor unions are really in their infancy to try and protect themselves. The owners have the power. They can just fire people, because if you think about it, in scientific management, you're just a piece in the machine. You're an unskilled worker. So you don't really bring your skill to the table that they're going to value. They can just fire you and hire someone new. And with huge influxes of immigrants, this is kind of going to be pretty common to take advantage of their workers. Have them work excessive hours, 14, 15-hour days. And when you look at what's going to happen, you also see some other aspects here. So what you're looking at here is children. These children, this little girl can't be more than like 6 years old. And now, when you look at it, it almost looks like, somebody who might be, let's say, like in our generation, like dressing up for Halloween, like in some kind of costume, but it's not. And in this time period, this person she's working in the fields for 14, 15 hours a day, and these are little children that are not going to school. They're working here, in mines, coal mines. They're working in factories. They're doing all this dirty, hard labor. They're newspaper hustlers. They call these people newsies. And this is common for people to go to work. And these immigrant families that they come from, they need the income, because they're not getting paid enough to support their family on just one income. And so they need their children to work. And so they're sending them out there because they need 4 incomes to make enough to survive in a city like New York City or any of these cities. And so you really have this disparity developing. You have two Americas. You have the super wealthy people who are owning the factories, and you have these factory workers who are not getting their fair share of their labor. And this is going to lead to a labor movement. It's going to lead to an era called the Progressive Era to try and fix these reforms. But a lot of countries kind of go through this progression of when they industrialize, when they become a manufacturing society. This battle between the working class and the owners of the factories is going to be prevalent in society. America takes a certain approach. Other countries are in the process now and are taking other approaches. So what we have to do is really kind of analyze, some of this stuff and take a look at, what we talked about in class with these ideas about poverty, the social gospel of wealth, social Darwinism. All these ideas that are out there, floating out there, are really going to influence Americans. And, like we learned in class, certain groups of Americans are going to believe that, poverty is, it's supposed to happen, it's supposed to be like this, and they have to work their way up. And so, there's all different kind of ideologies influencing people's opinions about what's developing here during industrialization. So what we're going to kind of lead off with, and what you guys have to kind of do for homework, is answer some of these questions. It's really going to make you think about what's going on, the working conditions that people are dealing with, some of these industrialists and how they're running their businesses, and kind of the connections between factory conditions, owners of the factories, and methods that factory owners are working, as well as the influence and or lack of influence of the government. All right, I'll see you guys in class on Monday.